There are places in the world that don't fully make sense. Ancient structures, strange formations, and discoveries that don't fit perfectly into what we know about history. They were found, studied, and documented, but some of them were never fully explained. In this video, we're going through some of the most unusual sites ever discovered, and the deeper you go, the more questions start to appear. If you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe, because some of these might stay in your mind longer than you expect. The tracks that lead nowhere. At first they look simple, just lines. Two parallel grooves cut into stone, running side by side across the surface as if something once passed through here, leaving behind a path that never fully disappeared. Tracks. That's what they look like. And for a moment, that explanation feels enough. But the longer you follow them, the more that feeling starts to fade. Because these are not marks left on soft ground. They are carved directly into solid rock, etched deep enough that time itself hasn't erased them, still visible after thousands of years. And that changes everything, because tracks are usually temporary. These are not. Across Malta, they appear again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes forming dense networks that spread across the landscape, crossing each other, splitting apart, merging again, creating patterns that don't feel random but also don't fully explain themselves. From above, it becomes clearer, not just one set, but many, layered, intersecting, almost like a system, but a system without a clear map, because they don't behave the way tracks should behave. They don't always connect. They don't always lead somewhere useful. And sometimes they just stop. Abruptly. At cliffs. At edges. Even at the coastline. And in some places they continue straight into the sea, disappearing beneath the water. As if whatever created them never intended to stop. And that is where the first real question begins. Because tracks are meant to go somewhere. They are meant to guide movement. To connect one place to another. But these don't always do that, which means either we are missing part of the system, or the system itself was never what we think it was. The grooves themselves are not shallow. Some cut deep into the stone, deep enough that something must have either worn them down over time or they were carved deliberately to that depth from the beginning, and both possibilities lead to very different explanations. If they were worn down, then something heavy must have passed over them repeatedly, something consistent, something that followed the same path again and again until the rock itself began to give way. But that raises another question. What could wear down stone like that? Because rock doesn't erode evenly under normal movement. Not in straight, parallel lines. Not with this level of consistency. And not across so many locations. Which brings in the idea of transport. One of the most common explanations suggests that these tracks were used to move heavy objects, possibly stone blocks used in construction, guided along fixed paths to prevent shifting or imbalance. And that idea fits part of the picture. Because Malta is known for its ancient structures, massive stone temples, built long before modern tools, and moving those stones would have required systems, paths, control, and these tracks could have been part of that. But then the pattern breaks again, because the tracks don't always connect to those sites. They don't always follow practical routes. Some go uphill, some cross uneven terrain, and some lead away from known locations entirely, which makes the explanation incomplete. Because a transport system should be efficient, it should reduce effort, but these don't always do that, and that creates doubt. Another idea suggests that the tracks are older than the structures themselves, possibly belonging to a time when the landscape was different, when the coastline was not where it is now, when areas that are currently underwater were once part of the land. And that idea changes the perspective. Because if sea levels were lower, then the tracks that now disappear into the ocean may have once continued further, connecting to areas that no longer exist above water. Which means what we see today is incomplete, only part of the original system, and that would explain some of the broken paths, some of the sudden endings, but not all of them, because even on land the pattern remains inconsistent. And that brings the focus back again to intention. Because carving into rock requires effort, not small effort, but sustained effort, time, labor, and planning. You don't create something like this without a reason. And that reason should leave a trace, a pattern, a system that makes sense, but here the sense is partial, visible in pieces, but not complete. And that is what keeps the mystery alive. Because we are not looking at something hidden. We are looking at something exposed, clear, present, and still not fully understood. Even today, researchers study these tracks, measure them, compare their spacing, analyze their direction, trying to find a consistent explanation that fits all of them. And while some patterns emerge, none explain everything. And that gap is important because it shows that the system, whatever it was, is more complex than a single explanation can cover. And maybe that is the key, that this was not one purpose, but many. Different uses, different times, different reasons that overlapped and created something that now looks unified, but was not originally designed as a single system. Or maybe we are still missing something. Something simple. Something that connects everything together in a way that hasn't been fully recognized yet. Because that happens. History is not always complete. Records are not always preserved. And sometimes what remains is only the physical trace, without the explanation that once existed alongside it. And that is exactly what these tracks are. A trace of movement, of effort, of something that once made sense to the people who created or used them, but no longer makes complete sense to us. And even now walking along those grooves, following them as they stretch across the land, there is a moment where the expectation returns, that they will lead somewhere, that they will connect, that they will finally explain themselves, but they don't. They just continue, and then stop. And that is where the mystery stays. Not hidden, not lost, but visible, and still unanswered. The chamber beneath the earth, it doesn't rise high above the landscape. It doesn't stand like a tower or a monument meant to be seen from far away. At first, it almost disappears into the land, a long mound of earth covered in grass, quiet, still. But beneath it, there is space, a chamber, hidden. And that is where everything changes. Because what looks like a simple rise in the ground is actually one of the oldest man-made burial structures in Britain. Built thousands of years ago with a level of planning and effort that isn't immediately visible from the outside. The entrance is narrow, low, not meant to be easy. And as you move inside, the space shifts from open landscape into something enclosed, something controlled, where stone replaces soil and the light fades quickly behind you. This is West Kennet Long Barrow. And it was not built quickly, not casually. The structure dates back to around 3600 BCE, placing it in a time when tools were simple, materials had to be moved by hand, and construction required coordination across groups of people working together with a clear intention. And that intention is visible in the design. The mound stretches over 100 meters in length, forming a long, raised structure that houses a series of chambers made from large stones, arranged carefully to create spaces within the earth. Not carved, built. Stone placed against stone, forming rooms, and those rooms were used, not once, but repeatedly, because this was not a single burial. It was a place that remained active over time, where human remains were placed, arranged, and sometimes moved, suggesting that the people who used it returned again and again. And that changes how it is understood, because this is not just a tomb. It is a site of continuation, a place connected to memory, to ritual, to something that it extended beyond a single moment. Inside, the chambers are small, separated, side rooms branching from a central passage, each holding remains that were placed there over time, sometimes carefully arranged, sometimes showing signs of later disturbance, indicating that the space was not sealed immediately. It remained open, accessible, used. And that raises a question. Why build something like this? Because the effort alone is significant. moving large stones, shaping the mound, creating internal spaces, all of it requiring time and coordination. And that level of effort suggests importance, not just for the individuals buried there, but for the people who built it. Because structures like this are not only about the dead, they are about the living, about how a community understands death, memory, and connection. The placement of the barrow itself is also deliberate. It sits within a landscape that contains other ancient structures, forming part of a wider network of sites that suggest the area held significance beyond a single location. Nearby, there are stone circles, stone earthworks, other markers, all connected, not physically, but through placement, through presence, which suggests that this was not an isolated construction. It was part of something larger, a landscape shaped by meaning. And that meaning is not fully preserved, because while the structure remains, the beliefs that shaped it are no longer fully known, leaving behind only the physical evidence of what was done, not the reasons why. And that creates a gap, because we can see the effort, we can measure the structure, we can analyze the remains, but the intention behind it is harder to define. Some interpretations suggest that the barrow was used for ancestor worship, a place where the dead were not removed from the living world, but remained part of it, present within the landscape, accessible, remembered. And that idea fits the design, because the chambers are not hidden permanently. They were entered, used, revisited, which means the relationship between the living and the dead was not distant, it was continuous. And that continuity is reflected in the structure itself, the long mound, the internal chambers, the repeated use, all of it forming a system that connects past and present within a single space. But even with that understanding, something still remains uncertain, because not all aspects of the site are fully explained. Why this exact location? Why this exact form? Why this specific arrangement of chambers? Because these choices were not random. They were made deliberately. And yet, the reasoning behind them is only partially understood. Over time, the barrow was eventually sealed, the entrance blocked, the chambers closed, ending the cycle of use that had continued for generations. And that moment is important, because it marks a change, a shift in how the space was used, or perhaps in how it was understood. And after that, it remained untouched, hidden beneath the earth until it was rediscovered. And even now, walking inside, the experience is different from being outside. The air feels still. The light is limited. The space is confined. And there is a sense that this was not built for comfort. It was built for purpose, a purpose that was clear to the people who made it, but is only partially visible to us now. And maybe that is what makes West Kennet Long Barrow stand out. Not because it is completely unknown, but because it represents something we can see but not fully explain. A structure built with intention, used over time, then closed, and left behind as part of a landscape that still holds traces of how people once understood life, death, and the connection between them. And that connection is still there, not in words, but in stone. The structures carved into stone, gurime. At a first, the landscape doesn't look like something that was built, because the shapes rise naturally from the ground, tall formations of soft volcanic rock that have been shaped over time by wind and erosion, creating pillars, cones, and surfaces that feel almost organic, as if the land itself decided to form them this way without any human involvement. But the closer you get, the more something begins to change, because these formations are not empty. They are hollowed, carved, used. Openings appear along the sides of the Asahur, small at first, almost easy to miss. But as you move closer, those openings reveal something deeper. Rooms carved directly into the stone, passages that lead inward, spaces that were shaped intentionally rather than formed naturally. And that is where the landscape stops being just geology and becomes something else entirely. Because what looks like a natural formation from a distance begins to reveal itself as a place that people lived in, moved through, and modified over time in ways that blend with the rock so completely that the line between natural and constructed becomes difficult to separate. The region of Göreme, in what is now modern-day Turkey, is known for this kind of landscape, formed from layers of volcanic ash that hardened into a material soft enough to carve but strong enough to hold its shape, allowing entire spaces to be created within the rock without the need for external building materials. And that combination changes everything, because instead of building structures on top of the land, people here carved into it, creating homes, storage areas, places of gathering, and even spaces of worship, all within the existing formations, turning the landscape itself into a living environment. The interiors are not rough, they are shaped, smoothed, designed. Walls curve gently. Ceilings rise in controlled arcs. Openings are placed where light can enter without weakening the structure. And that level of control suggests understanding, not just of how to carve the rock, but how to shape space in a way that remains stable over time. And stability matters, because these spaces have lasted for centuries. In some cases, over 1,000 years. Still visible. Still accessible. But what makes Göreme different is not just the presence of these carved spaces. It is the scale and the layering. Because this is not a single structure or a small group of dwellings. It is an entire landscape shaped by human activity, where multiple levels of rooms exist within the same formation, connected by narrow passages, stair-like cuts, and openings that allow movement between spaces without ever leaving the stone itself. And that creates something unique, because this is not architecture. In the usual sense, it is integration. The natural form remains, but the inside changes. And that balance between natural and carved is what defines the place. Because the structures are not imposed on the landscape, they are part of it, shaped in a way that respects the material while still transforming it into something functional. Some of these spaces were used as homes. Others served different purposes: storage, shelter, protection. And over time, more complex uses appeared, including churches carved into the rock, with interiors that were not only shaped structurally, but also decorated, painted with images that still remain visible, adding another layer to the space that goes beyond function and into expression. And that tells us something important. Because carving a room is one thing, but decorating it means it mattered. It was not temporary, it was meant to be used, lived in, returned to. And that continuity changes how we see it, because now this is not just a survival adaptation, it is a way of life that developed around the material, using what was available in a way that made sense within the environment. The rock itself made this possible. Soft enough to carve, strong enough to hold. And that combination is rare, because if it were harder, carving would be too difficult. If it were softer, the structures would collapse. But here, it holds. And that allowed people to expand, to create more spaces, to build inward instead of outward. And that inward construction creates a different kind of environment, one that is protected from external conditions, insulated from temperature changes, and less visible from a distance, which may have also served as a form of protection. Because visibility matters. And here, much of what exists is hidden, blended into the rock, not immediately obvious, unless you are close enough to see it. And that could have been intentional. Because in times of conflict or instability, spaces like this provide shelter in ways that open structures cannot. And that adds another layer. Not just living, but protection. And maybe that is part of why these structures continued to be used over time, adapting to different needs, expanding, changing, but always remaining part of the same system. Because this is not a single moment. It is a long process, one that continued across generations, each adding something, each shaping the space further, and that accumulation is still visible, not as separate parts, but as one continuous environment. And even now, walking through these spaces, the feeling is different from being outside, because the rock surrounds you, the light changes, the sound shifts, and the sense of space becomes more controlled, more enclosed, more intentional. And that feeling remains, because even though the people who carved these structures are no longer there, the spaces they created still hold the shape of how they lived, how they moved, how they adapted to the environment around them. And maybe that is what makes Gorame stand out. Not because it is entirely mysterious, but because it represents a different way of building, a different way of thinking about space, where the land itself becomes the structure, and the boundary between natural and human-made becomes almost impossible to separate. And that leaves something behind. Not just stone, but a record of how people once shaped the world around them by working within it. The platforms built before memory. Dharam Rajka stone platforms. At first glance, the site does not immediately reveal what it is, because what you see are raised stone surfaces, low and wide, spread across the ground in a way that feels deliberate but not immediately obvious, as if the landscape itself has been adjusted rather than constructed, shaped into flat levels that hold their form without drawing too much attention to themselves. But the more time you spend looking at them, the clearer it becomes that these are not natural formations, because the stones are placed arranged in ways that create level platforms, surfaces that interrupt the uneven ground and replace it with something controlled, something that suggests intention rather than chance. And that intention is where the questions begin, because platforms are not built without purpose. They exist to support something, to elevate something, to create a defined space that separates what is on it from what is around it. And here, that purpose is not immediately visible. There are no standing walls, no clear structures rising above them, just the platforms themselves, low, solid, enduring. And that absence of visible structures creates a gap, because if something once stood here, it is no longer present, leaving behind only the base, only the foundation of something that has not survived in the same way. Which raises the first real question. What was here? Because the effort required to create these platforms is not small. The stones had to be gathered, placed, adjusted to create flat surfaces in a landscape that does not naturally provide them, and doing that repeatedly across multiple areas suggests that this was not a single construction but part of a larger pattern, a system. And systems are built with intention. The location itself adds another layer, because sites like Dharam Rajka are often connected to long histories of human activity where different periods overlap, where structures are built, rebuilt, and sometimes replaced, leaving behind layers of use that are not always easy to separate. And that means what we see now may not represent a single moment in time, but many. Some platforms may belong to one phase, others to another, each serving a purpose that made sense at the time they were used. And that makes interpretation more complex, because without clear records, the function of these platforms has to be understood through what remains, through placement, through structure, through comparison. And one possibility is that they were used for ritual purposes, spaces where activities were performed in a defined area, elevated slightly from the surrounding ground, creating a boundary that separates the ordinary from something more significant. And that idea fits the design, because platforms create focus. They draw attention, they define space, and they are often used in places where meaning is attached to location. But that is not the only possibility, because platforms can also serve practical functions. They can support structures made from materials that do not survive, such as wood or other organic elements that decay over time, leaving behind only the stone base. And if that is the case, then what we are seeing is not the full structure, only the part that endured. And that changes the interpretation again, because now the absence is not a mystery. It is a result of time, of decay, of materials that did not last. And that brings the focus back to what remains, the stone, the layout, the repetition, because repetition suggests pattern, and pattern suggests purpose. The platforms are not scattered randomly. They appear in positions that feel intentional, spaced in ways that may relate to movement, to gathering, or to something that required multiple defined areas rather than a single central structure. And that distribution matters, because it suggests use across space, not just at a single point. And that could indicate activity. Not static placement, but movement, people moving between platforms, using different areas for different purposes. And that idea aligns with how many ancient sites functioned, not as single buildings, but as environments where different parts served different roles within a larger system. And that system is what we are trying to see, even if parts of it are missing, even if the full structure no longer exists. Because what remains is enough to suggest that something was here, something that required effort, planning, coordination, and time. And time is the key, because structures like this are not built quickly. They are developed, expanded, adjusted, and that means the site itself may have changed over its period of use, evolving as needs changed, as practices shifted, as new ideas replaced old ones. And that evolution leaves traces, not always clear, not always complete, but present in the way the stones the ice are placed, in the way the platforms relate to each other, in the way the site feels organized, even without visible structures rising above it. And even now, standing among these platforms, the experience is different from standing on untouched ground, because the surface is level, controlled, shaped by human hands long ago, creating a space that feels intentional, even without knowing exactly why it was made. And that feeling is what remains, because the explanation may not be complete, but the evidence is the platforms are here, they were built, they were used, and they were left behind, and maybe that is what defines them, not what they once supported, but what they still show, that something existed here, something that mattered enough to shape the land, even if the full story is no longer visible. The passage built for the dead, Stony Littleton Long Barrow. At first it looks like part of the land, a long raised mound stretching quietly across the countryside, covered in grass, blending into the surrounding terrain in a way that doesn't immediately draw attention, as if it has always been there and simply became part of the natural shape of the place over time. But as you approach it, the shape begins to feel more defined, more deliberate, because this is not just a natural rise in the ground, it is constructed, built carefully using earth and stone to create a structure that extends outward in a long, narrow form, holding something within it that is not visible from the outside. And that hidden interior is where everything changes, because beneath the mound there is a passage, a long corridor built from stone slabs set upright and capped with larger stones above, forming a tunnel-like space that leads inward, deeper into the structure, guiding movement toward a central area where smaller chambers branch off. This is Stony Littleton Long Barrow, and it was not built quickly. It dates back to around 3500 BCE, placing it in a time when communities worked together to create structures that required coordination, effort, and a shared understanding of purpose. Because building something like this is not a single task, it is a process that involves gathering materials, shaping the land, placing stones with precision, and ensuring that the structure remains stable over time. And stability is visible here. The stones still hold. The passage still stands. The chambers are still intact. And that endurance is not accidental, it reflects knowledge, an understanding of how to build with the materials available in a way that allows the structure to last far beyond the people who created it. Inside, the space narrows, the light fades, the air changes, and the environment becomes controlled, enclosed, shaped by stone rather than open sky, creating a space that feels separate from the outside world, not just physically but in purpose. Because this was not built as a place to live. It was built as a place to hold, to contain, to preserve, and what it held were human remains. Not one, but many, placed within the chambers over time, suggesting that this was not a single burial event, but a site that remained in use across generations, where the dead were brought, placed, and left within the structure, becoming part of it. And that repeated use is important, because it changes the meaning of the space. This is not just a tomb. It is a place of return, a place where the living came back again and again, adding to what was already there, maintaining a connection between themselves and those who came before. And that connection is reflected in the design. The long passage, the side chambers, the structure that guides movement inward, all of it creating a path, not just physically, but symbolically, moving from the outside world into a space that was set apart, defined by its purpose, and that purpose is not fully recorded. There are no written accounts from the people who built it, no direct explanation of why it was constructed in this way, but the structure itself provides clues, because effort reflects importance. And the effort here is significant. The mound extends over a considerable length. The stones used in the passage are large, heavy, and placed with care. The chambers are arranged in a way that suggests planning rather than random placement, and that planning indicates intention, but intention without explanation leaves space for interpretation. Some suggest that the barrow served as a communal burial site, a place where a group of people, possibly connected by kinship or community, were brought together even after death, creating a shared space that held them collectively rather than individually. And that idea fits the structure, because the chambers are not isolated. They are connected, part of a single system. And that system suggests unity, not separation. Others see it as part of a broader ritual landscape connected to other structures in the region, forming a network of sites that together create a map of meaning, where each location plays a role within a larger understanding of life, death, and memory. And that perspective changes how the barrow is viewed, because now it is not just a single structure, it is part of something larger, something that extends beyond its physical boundaries. And that idea is supported by the location, because sites like this are rarely placed randomly. They are positioned with awareness of the surrounding land, of visibility, of relation to other features, and that suggests that the placement itself was meaningful, not just practical, but intentional. And even now, standing at the entrance, looking into the passage, there is a sense that the space is defined by more than its physical form. The stones guide movement. The narrowing corridor draws attention inward. The chambers create points of pause, and the entire structure feels designed to shape experience, not just to hold remains, but to create a journey from outside to inside, from light to darkness, from open space to enclosed chamber. And that journey may have been part of its purpose, not just where it leads, but how it feels. And that is something that does not fully disappear even now, because the structure remains. The passage is still there. The chambers still hold their shape, and the experience of moving through it still reflects the design choices made thousands of years ago. And maybe that is what makes Stony Littleton Long Barrow stand out. Not because it is completely unknown, but because it preserves a way of thinking, a way of building, a way of understanding space and purpose that is no longer directly explained, but still visible in the structure itself. And that visibility is enough to show that something important happened here, that people came here, built this, used it, returned to it, and eventually left it behind, leaving only the structure and the questions that remain within it. The hills that hold the dead, Archaeological. At first, it just looks like hills, quiet, open, nothing unusual. But the ground here is not empty, because beneath these rounded rises are chambers built from stone, hidden inside the hills themselves, forming one of the oldest and most overlooked burial landscapes in Ireland. This is Archaeological. And it isn't just one site, it's many. Scattered across the hills, dozens of stone cairns, each one covering a chamber, each one placed in a position that feels chosen rather than random, creating a pattern across the landscape that only becomes clear when you step back and see the whole area together. From a distance, they blend in, just part of the land. But up close, the structure appears. Because the stones are arranged, the mounds are shaped, and the entrances are aligned in ways that suggest intention, not accident. And that intention matters, because building even one of these requires effort, moving stones, shaping the mound, creating internal chambers that can hold their form over time, and doing that repeatedly across multiple locations suggests something organized, a system, not isolated construction, but connected activity. Inside, the chambers are small, enclosed, built from large stone slabs placed upright and capped above, creating spaces that are protected, contained, and separated from the outside world. And those spaces were used, not once, but over time. Human remains have been found inside, showing that these were burial places, but not in a simple sense, because the remains are often arranged, sometimes moved, sometimes added to, suggesting that these chambers were opened and reused. And that changes the meaning, because this is not a single burial. It is a place of return, a place where people came back again and again, placing the dead within the same space, creating a connection between generations that remained active over time. And that idea is reflected in the layout. The cairns are not placed randomly. They sit on elevated ground, overlooking the surrounding land, positioned in ways that give them visibility even if they do not stand out immediately. And that suggests awareness, choice, placement that meant something. Some of the chambers are aligned, not perfectly, but noticeably, with the direction of the sun, particularly during certain times of the year, when light enters the chamber in a way that does not happen at other times, creating a moment where the interior is briefly illuminated. And that alignment raises another question, because it suggests that time mattered. Not just location, not just structure, but timing. Moments when something changed. When light entered, when the space became different. And that adds another layer, because now the chambers are not just for holding remains. They are part of a cycle, connected to the sky, to movement, to something beyond the ground itself. But even with all of this, the full meaning is not clear, because there are no written records from the people who built them. No direct explanation. Only the structures. Only the placement. Only the remains. And that leaves interpretation open. Some see it as a burial landscape, a place where the dead were brought together. Others see something more, a connection between life and death, between earth and sky, between presence and memory. And both views exist at the same time, because the evidence allows for it, but does not fully confirm it. And maybe that is what makes Archaeological different. Not because it is unknown, but because it is incomplete. We see the system. We understand parts of it, but not all of it. And that gap is what remains. Even now, walking across those hills, the silence feels different. Not empty, but holding something. Because beneath the ground, the chambers are still there, still intact, still part of the landscape. And the pattern still exists, spread across the hills, repeating, enduring, without fully explaining itself. And that is where the mystery stays, not hidden, but visible, waiting to be understood. The chamber that faces the light, my showway. It doesn't rise sharply from the land. It sits low, rounded, almost quiet against the open landscape. At first, it feels like part of the ground itself, just a mound. But that surface hides something much more deliberate, because beneath it is a carefully constructed chamber, built from large stones arranged with precision and aligned in a way that connects it, not just to the earth, but to the sky above. This is my show. And it was not placed here by chance. The structure dates back to around 2800 BCE, built during a time when creating something like this required coordination, effort, and a clear understanding of how materials behave, because the stones used in its construction are large, heavy, and positioned in a way that allows the interior to remain stable even after thousands of years. The entrance is narrow, low, designed in a way that requires you to lower yourself as you move inside, shifting from open space into something enclosed, something controlled, where the outside world begins to fade. And that transition is immediate. Light drops, sound changes. The air becomes still, and the passage leads inward, straight, focused, until it reaches the central chamber. The space inside is not random, it is shaped, carefully. Large stone slabs form the walls. The ceiling rises above in a way that distributes weight evenly, preventing collapse, showing an understanding of structure that goes beyond simple stacking of materials. And that understanding matters, because this chamber has lasted through time, through weather, through change, still holding its form, still accessible, still intact. And that endurance reflects intention, because this was built to remain. But what makes my show stand out is not just the structure itself, it is the alignment. Because the passage that leads into the chamber is positioned in a very specific direction, one that connects it to the movement of the sun during a particular time of the year. At the winter solstice, when the days are shortest and the sun sits low on the horizon, something happens. Light enters. Not randomly, not briefly, but directly, traveling through the passage, reaching into the chamber, illuminating the interior in a way that does not occur at other times. And that moment changes how the structure is understood, because this is not accidental. It is precise, measured, planned, which means the people who built this were not only working with stone, they were working with time, with cycles, with the movement of the sky. And that adds another layer, because now the structure is not just connected to the ground, it is connected to something above it, something that repeats, something predictable, something that could be observed, and that observation was built into the structure itself. But the purpose of that alignment is not fully clear. Some suggest it represents a connection between life and death, a symbolic moment where light enters darkness, where the outside world reaches into the enclosed space, and that idea fits, because the chamber is not open, it is sealed, separated, and the light becomes a moment of connection. But without direct records, that interpretation remains uncertain, because the meaning was never written down in a way that survived. Only the structure remains, and the structure tells us what was done, but not exactly why. Inside the chamber, there are also markings, not from the original builders, but from later visitors. Carvings left behind centuries after the structure was built, showing that the site continued to be entered, continued to be used, continued to hold significance even as time passed and its original purpose became less clear. And that continued use matters, because it shows that the structure did not lose its importance. It changed, adapted, but remained present, and that presence is still felt. Because even now, standing inside the chamber, the space feels controlled, contained, shaped in a way that directs attention, that limits movement, that focuses everything toward the center, and that focus feels intentional, because nothing here is random. The placement, the structure, the alignment, all of it reflects decisions. Choices made by people who understood what they were creating, even if we no longer fully understand their reasons. And maybe that is what makes my show stand out. Not because it is completely mysterious, but because it exists at the edge of understanding, where the physical design is clear, the construction is visible, the alignment is measurable, but the meaning behind it remains open. And that openness is what remains, a structure built with precision, aligned with the sky, used across time, and still holding something that is not fully explained. The structures that stored more than grain. Harappa granaries. At first they appear as foundations, rows of raised platforms made from brick, arranged in a pattern that feels organized but not immediately obvious, as if what once stood above them has disappeared, leaving only the base behind. There are no roofs, no walls rising high, no visible storage, just the structure beneath. And that is where the question begins. Because foundations like this are not built without purpose, and the effort required to create them suggests something important once existed here. Something that needed elevation, stability, and separation from the ground. These are often referred to as the granaries of Harappa, part of one of the earliest urban civilizations known, the Indus Valley Civilization, where cities were planned with a level of organization that still stands out today, with streets laid out in grids, drainage systems carefully designed, and structures built with uniform materials. And within that system, these platforms appear, repeated, aligned, structured, and that repetition suggests function. Because when something is built more than once in the same pattern, it is rarely accidental. It is part of a system. And systems are built with intention. The platforms themselves are raised, not directly on the ground, but slightly elevated, creating space beneath them, allowing air to move, reducing moisture, protecting whatever was stored above from dampness and decay. And that design makes sense, because if these were used to store grain, then protection would be essential. Grain must stay dry, it must be preserved, and the structure would need to support that. But even with that explanation, something remains uncertain, because the structures are large, very large, and their layout is not entirely simple. They are divided, segmented, separated into sections, which suggests organization, not just storage, but distribution, management, something more controlled. And that raises another question. Were these just granaries, or were they part of something larger? Because storing food is not just about keeping it. It is about controlling it, distributing it, managing supply. And that level of organization suggests a system beyond simple storage, something connected to administration, to planning, to the structure of the society itself. And that is where Harappa stands out. Because this was not a small settlement. It was a city, part of a network, connected to other sites, sharing similar designs, similar materials, similar planning. Which means these structures were not isolated ideas. They were part of a larger approach, a way of building, a way of organizing space, and that consistency suggests knowledge, not trial and error, but understanding, because the bricks used here are uniform, standardized, made to specific sizes, which means they were produced with intention, with measurement, with planning. And that level of standardization reflects a society that understood control, not just over materials, but over systems. And that is what these structures represent. Not just storage, but organization. And even now, standing among the remains, the layout becomes clearer, because the platforms are arranged in ways that suggest movement, paths between them, spaces that allow access, areas that separate one section from another. And that suggests use, not static, but active. People moving, carrying, placing, removing. A system in motion. And that motion is no longer visible, but the structure remains. And that is what we see. Not the activity itself, but the framework that supported it. And that framework raises questions. Because while the design suggests storage, there is no direct evidence that confirms exactly what was kept here. No preserved grain in large quantities. No clear markers that identify the contents with certainty. And that creates doubt. Because interpretation depends on evidence. And when evidence is incomplete, explanations remain open. Some suggest alternative uses. Assembly areas, workspaces, places where goods were collected and managed before being distributed. And those ideas are possible, because the structure supports organization, not just storage. And that flexibility makes it harder to define, because now the function is not fixed. It becomes a range, a possibility. And that is where the mystery remains, not in the structure itself, but in its exact use. Because we can see how it was built. We can understand why elevation matters, why organization matters. But the precise role it played within the society is not fully preserved. And maybe that is what makes it significant. Because it represents a system we can see, but not fully reconstruct. A structure that shows planning, coordination, and control, but leaves open the question of how exactly it fit into the daily life of the people who used it. And that question is still there. Not hidden, but unanswered, even as the foundations remain, even as the layout is visible, even as the structure continues to show us what was built, but not exactly why. The stones that stand without explanation, Al-Rajajal, in the open desert of northern Saudi Arabia, where the land stretches outward in long, quiet distances and the horizon feels uninterrupted, there is a place where the ground changes in a way that doesn't immediately follow the natural pattern of the landscape. Stone pillars rise from the earth, tall, thin, standing in groups. At first they look like scattered rocks, but they are not, because these stones are placed, arranged, positioned in lines and clusters that suggest intention rather than accident, forming one of the most unusual prehistoric sites in the region, known today as Archaeological. From a distance the formations appear irregular, but as you move closer and begin to observe them more carefully, patterns begin to emerge, because the stones are not randomly distributed. They are grouped in ways that hint at structure, with some aligned in rows and others forming circular or semicircular arrangements. And that arrangement matters, because placing stones like this requires effort, especially in an environment where resources are limited, and moving large rocks across open terrain is not a simple task. Which means these were not left here by chance. They were brought, placed, and that leads to the first question. Why? Because the effort alone suggests purpose, and when purpose is not immediately visible, it becomes something that needs to be understood through the structure itself. Each stone varies in size, some taller, some shorter, but all share a similar form, narrow, vertical, and positioned upright, which means they were set intentionally, placed into the ground in a way that allows them to remain standing over long periods of time. And that stability is important, because these stones have remained, exposed to wind, to heat, to time, and still standing, which reflects not only the durability of the material but also the way they were placed, with a base that supports the weight above and prevents collapse. But even with that understanding, the function is not clear. There are no obvious markings, no carvings, no written records connected directly to the site, only the stones themselves, and their arrangement, which means interpretation relies on pattern, on comparison, on context. Some researchers suggest that Al-Rajajil may have been used as a ritual site, a place where gatherings occurred, where activities were performed within a defined space created by the placement of the stones. And that idea fits part of the structure, because the grouping creates boundaries, defines areas, separates space, but the layout is not uniform. Not all groups follow the same pattern. Some are aligned, others are scattered, and that variation makes it harder to assign a single function to the entire site. Another possibility is that the stones were used as markers, indicators, something that defined location, direction, or significance within the landscape. And that idea connects to how ancient people interacted with open environments, using visible structures to create reference points in places where natural landmarks were limited. But again, the arrangement complicates the explanation, because markers are usually placed in ways that follow clear lines or paths, and here, the pattern is not always consistent, which brings the focus back to observation. Because sometimes the meaning of a structure is not in what it does directly, but in how it relates to its surroundings. And in this case, the surroundings are open, wide, uninterrupted, which means anything placed here becomes visible, noticeable. And that visibility could have been part of its purpose, not hidden, but seen, standing out against the landscape, creating a presence. And that presence may have held meaning, even if that meaning is no longer fully understood. The age of the site adds another layer, because Al-Rajajil dates back thousands of years, placing it within a period where written records are limited, and much of what we understand comes from physical remains rather than documented history. And that means the stones are the primary source of information, what they show, how they are placed, how they relate to each other. And even that information is incomplete, because time changes things. Stones fall, positions shift. The original layout may not be fully preserved, which means what we see now may be only part of the original design. And that possibility keeps the interpretation open, because without a complete picture, conclusions remain uncertain. And that uncertainty is what defines the site, not because it is entirely unknown, but because it is not fully explained. We understand the material, we see the placement, we recognize the effort, but the exact purpose remains unclear. And that gap is where the interest remains. because the stones are still there, still standing, still forming patterns that suggest something deliberate, something planned, even if the plan itself is no longer visible. And even now, walking among them, the feeling is different from standing in an empty landscape, because the stones create space. They define areas. They interrupt the openness in a way that feels intentional, not random, not natural, but placed. And that placement is what remains. A record of something that happened here, something that required effort, something that mattered, even if the reason is no longer fully clear. The fortress that watches the valley, Shaori Fortress, high above the surrounding valley where the terrain rises into rough and uneven ground and the natural landscape begins to shift from open land into stone and elevation, there is a structure that does not immediately separate itself from its environment, because it is built in a way that follows the mountain rather than standing against it, using the same materials, the same colors, and the same natural lines, making it appear at first like nothing more than part of the terrain itself. But that impression slowly changes the closer you get, because what initially feels natural begins to reveal signs of placement, of control, of deliberate construction, where stones are not simply resting where they fell, but arranged, fitted together, forming walls that hold shape and direction, creating boundaries that define space in a way that nature alone does not typically produce. This is Shaori Fortress, and its position is not, it's accidental. Because from where it stands, the view extends across the valley below with a clarity that immediately suggests purpose, offering visibility over movement, over pathways, over any approach that might come from a distance, making it a location that provides awareness long before anything reaches it. And that alone begins to explain part of why it exists, because elevation has always been linked to control, not just in terms of defense, but in terms of observation, allowing those within the structure to see without being easily approached, to understand the land below in a way that those on the ground cannot. But the fortress is not just a single wall or a simple enclosure, because as you move along its edges, the structure reveals layers, sections that follow the uneven surface of the mountain, creating different levels that are connected but distinct, suggesting that this was not built as a single flat design, but adapted carefully to the terrain, using the shape of the land as part of the structure itself. The stones used in its construction vary in size and shape, but they are placed with a level of precision that allows them to hold together without mortar, relying instead on weight, balance, and the way each piece supports the others, creating a stability that has allowed the fortress to remain standing over long periods of time, despite exposure to weather, temperature changes, and natural wear. And that stability is not accidental, because building something like this requires understanding, not just of how to stack stone, but how to distribute pressure, how to align pieces so that they lock into place, how to create walls that can withstand both time and environment without collapsing. But even with that understanding, the exact time when the fortress was built is not entirely clear. And that uncertainty adds another layer, because without a precise date, it becomes more difficult to connect the structure to a specific historical moment, leaving its origins partially open, defined more by its physical characteristics than by written records. And that is where interpretation begins, because when a structure cannot be fully placed within a clear timeline, its purpose must be understood through what it shows rather than what is recorded, through its design, its location, and the way it interacts with the surrounding environment. One possibility is that it functioned as a defensive stronghold, a place designed to protect those within it while providing a strategic advantage over those approaching from below. And this idea fits naturally with its elevated position, its visibility, and the presence of walls that create separation between inside and outside. But the structure suggests something more than simple defense, because the internal organization indicates that this was not just a place to stand and watch, but a place to remain, with areas that could have supported activity beyond observation, suggesting that people may have stayed here, used it over time, made it part of their environment rather than just a temporary position. And that possibility expands the purpose, because now the fortress is not just about protection, but about presence, about establishing a point within the landscape that holds meaning, that defines control not only through visibility, but through permanence. The way the walls follow the terrain also reflects a deeper understanding of the land itself, because instead of forcing a shape onto the mountain, the builders worked with it, adjusting the structure to match the natural contours, which not only makes construction more efficient, but also strengthens the overall design by allowing the land to support the structure rather than resist it. And that approach creates something that feels integrated, almost hidden in plain sight, because from a distance, the fortress does not stand out sharply against the environment. It blends, becoming part of the mountain rather than something placed on top of it. But up close, the difference is clear because the lines are too precise, the arrangement too controlled, the structure too consistent to be natural, revealing a level of human involvement that transforms the landscape into something shaped, something intentional. Over time, structures like this often change, not remaining exactly as they were when first built, but adapting, expanding, being repaired or modified as needs shift, and that possibility exists here as well, because the variation in the stones and the layout suggests that the fortress may not have been constructed all at once, but developed over time, with different phases adding to what already existed. And that means what we see now is not a single moment preserved, but a result of multiple moments layered together, each contributing to the final form, each leaving traces that are not always easy to separate. And even now, standing within its boundaries, there is a noticeable difference in how the space feels compared to the open land below. Because the walls create enclosure, the elevation creates distance, and the structure itself defines an area that is separate, controlled, shaped by intention rather than chance. And that feeling remains, even without knowing the full history. Because the physical presence of the fortress communicates something that does not require explanation, something that can be observed directly in the way it stands, in the way it interacts with the landscape, in the way it holds its position over the valley. And maybe that is what makes Shaori Fortress stand out, not because it is completely unknown, but because it represents something that is only partially understood, where the structure itself is clear, the effort is visible, the purpose is suggested, but the full story remains just out of reach. And that is what stays, not a complete mystery, but an incomplete understanding, a structure that shows us what was built, how it was built, and where it was placed, but leaves open the question of why it was done in exactly this way, at exactly this time, by the people who chose this place and shaped it into something that still remains.